Look, I'll be the first to admit, I didn't want to go on this trip. The whole idea of booking a remote cabin at some Alaskan ski resort in the middle of nowhere, during the off-season, no less, was all Ethan's crazy idea. He'd pitched it to the group with the kind of over-the-top enthusiasm that makes it impossible to say no without seeming like a total downer. "Come on, Alex," he'd said, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "It'll be an adventure!" A break from the grind. It sounded good in theory. Snow-covered slopes, a roaring fireplace, and the kind of isolation that promised nothing but peace and quiet. But as our shuttle wound its way up the icy mountain road, past dense forests and sheer cliffs that dropped off into nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling that this whole trip was a big mistake. The cabin came into view just as the sun started to dip behind the mountains, casting long, jagged shadows over the snow. It wasn't anything like the glossy photos online. The wooden exterior was weathered and gray, the kind of gray that comes from years of neglect. A single porch light flickered weakly, barely cutting through the gloom. "Home sweet home," Ethan said, hopping out of the shuttle with his usual boundless energy. Mason and Cole followed, each lugging their bags through the slush, while I lingered behind, staring up at the cabin. Something about it felt off, like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to cross the threshold. Our driver, a gruff man in his late 50s, unloaded our gear in silence. As he handed me my bag, he muttered under his breath, "Be careful out here. Weather can change fast." I thanked him, but he didn't stick around for small talk. He climbed back into the shuttle, his tires crunching against the ice as he drove off, leaving us alone with the cabin and the oppressive quiet of the mountains. The door creaked open like something out of a horror movie as we stepped inside. The air was colder than I'd expected, and it carried the faint scent of damp wood and something metallic like old pipes. The main room was small but cozy enough, with a stone fireplace on one side and a few mismatched pieces of furniture scattered around. A narrow hallway led to the bedrooms and a single bathroom. "Not bad," Ethan said, tossing his bag onto the worn-out couch. "Definitely got that rustic charm." Mason, ever the practical one, wandered toward the kitchen. "Do we have running water? Heat?" Cole, always eager to keep the peace, chimed in. "It's not so bad. A little cold, but it's got character." I wasn't convinced. Something about the cabin felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the windows seemed too dark, even though the curtains were open, or the faint creak of the floorboards, as if the place were shifting under its own weight. Then there was him. He appeared out of nowhere, stepping into the room from the hallway like a shadow materializing from the walls. He was tall and thin, with a gaunt face and eyes that darted around like they were trying to take in everything at once. He wore a heavy sweater and jeans that looked a size too big for him. "You must be the group for Cabin 3, he said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "I'm Silas, the caretaker." "He-man," Ethan said, offering his usual friendly smile. "Appreciate you getting this place ready for us." Silas didn't respond right away. His eyes lingered on each of us, as if he were sizing us up. When his gaze settled on me, I felt an uncomfortable pressure, like he could see something in me that I didn't want him to see. "Let me know if you need anything," he said finally. "I'll be staying in the caretaker's room at the end of the hall. Don't go in there. It's policy." "Of course," Cole said quickly, his politeness almost desperate. "We'll let you do your thing." Silas nodded and disappeared back into the hallway. The air felt heavier in his absence, like he'd taken something with him when he left. "Creepy," Ethan muttered. Did anyone else feel like he was staring into their soul? He's probably just not used to company, Mason said, though even he sounded uncertain. Let's unpack and get settled. We'll hit the slopes tomorrow. We spent the evening trying to make the cabin feel like home. Ethan cranked up the old heater, which groaned in protest before sputtering to life. Mason checked the fireplace, making sure it was safe to use. Cole rummaged through the kitchen cabinets, finding mismatched plates and a single cast iron pan that looked older than all of us combined. I busied myself with unpacking in one of the small bedrooms. The walls were thin, and I could hear the others talking and laughing in the main room. Their voices were a comfort, cutting through the unsettling quiet that seemed to creep in whenever the conversation lagged. But as I tucked my bag under the bed, I noticed something strange. The floorboards near the far wall were slightly raised, as if something had been pried up and poorly replaced. I knelt down, running my fingers over the uneven wood. It didn't feel loose, but it was definitely out of place. "Alex, you coming?" Ethan's voice broke my focus. I straightened up quickly, brushing off the unease. "Yeah, be right there." We stayed up late, drinking cheap beer and talking about nothing in particular. The cabin was warmer now, the fire crackling in the hearth, and for a while I let myself relax. Maybe I was overthinking things. It was just an old cabin, after all, and Silas was just a weird dude. Not everyone was cut out for small talk. By the time we called it a night, the storm had picked up. The wind howled against the windows, and the trees outside groaned under the weight of the snow. I climbed into bed, pulling the blankets tight around me, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, felt amplified in the dark. At some point in the night, I heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, moving from one end to the other. I told myself it was just Silas, but the thought didn't bring much comfort. I lay there, still staring at the ceiling until the footsteps faded and the cabin fell silent again. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the landscape blanketed in fresh snow. Ethan was the first to wake, his usual energy undimmed by the restless night. "Let's hit the slopes," he said, practically bouncing as he pulled on his gear. Mason and Cole were slower to get moving, but eventually we all bundled up and headed outside. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your skin but feels invigorating. As we made our way to the ski lift, I glanced back at the cabin. Silas stood in the window, watching us. His face was pale and expressionless, and for a moment I thought I saw his lips move, as if he were speaking to someone. But when I blinked, he was gone. Something about the way the cabin loomed against the mountains made my stomach twist. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stepped into something we didn't understand, and I was starting to think we wouldn't leave the same way we'd come. The morning sun, pale and hesitant, stretched across the snow, painting the world in shades of cold silver. We'd barely made it to the slopes before Ethan was bounding ahead, his energy undeterred by the biting wind. Mason, Cole, and I followed at a slower pace, lugging our gear while trying to ignore the strange weight that still hung over us from the cabin. Cole broke the silence. "Do you think Silas is okay?" His voice was soft, almost drowned out by the crunch of snow beneath our boots. "Define okay?" Mason said. He wasn't one to mince words. "The guy's definitely odd, but maybe he's just one of those loner types, you know, lives out here for the solitude." "Solitude doesn't mean acting like a total weirdo," Ethan chimed in from ahead, turning to walk backwards so he could face us. "Did you see the way he watched us last night, like we were trespassing in his personal playground? He is the caretaker. I pointed out. Technically, this is his turf. Ethan shrugged and turned back around. Doesn't mean I have to like it, Bob. The ski lift creaked and groaned as it carried us up the slope, its rhythmic squeaking adding to the unease I couldn't shake. The resort itself was nearly deserted, and the blanket of fresh snow muffled every sound, making the world feel eerily still. I could see only a handful of other skiers in the distance, their colorful jackets mere dots against the endless white. Kind of quiet for a ski resort, Cole muttered, echoing my thoughts. It's the off-season, Mason replied, adjusting his goggles. Probably why we got the cabin for so cheap. Doesn't explain why it feels like we're the last people on Earth, I said, my breath fogging in the cold air. As we reached the top, the view stretched out before us, vast, untouched snowfields framed by jagged peaks. For a moment, the sheer beauty of it all made me forget my unease. Ethan was already strapping on his skis, grinning like a kid let loose on Christmas morning. Race you to the bottom, he called, and before any of us could answer, he was off, carving a wild path down the slope. Cole sighed, shaking his head. He's going to break something one of these days. Let's hope it's not today, Mason said. Then he turned to me. Ready. I nodded, but as I adjusted my boots, I caught a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. Turning my head, I saw a figure standing among the trees below, a lone silhouette, dark against the snow. Even from this distance, I knew who it was. Silas. He was standing perfectly still, watching us. I couldn't see his face, but the way he stood, rigid and unyielding, made my stomach twist. Why was he here? Had he followed us? Alex, you good? Mason's voice snapped me out of it. I turned back to him, forcing a smile. Yeah, let's go. We pushed off, gliding down the slope after Ethan. The wind stung my face, and the sound of my skis cutting through the snow filled my ears, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. Ethan burst through the door first, still buzzing with energy. That was incredible. Did you see that jump I hit? Nailed it? Barely, Mason said, tossing his gloves onto the counter. You're lucky you didn't wipe out. Cole laughed softly as he hung his coat by the door. I thought for sure you were going to eat it. I didn't join in the banter. My eyes were drawn to the storage room at the far end of the hall. Something about it felt off, though I couldn't pinpoint why. While the others were unpacking, I slipped inside. The room was small, lined with shelves stocked with firewood, old tools, and miscellaneous supplies. Our ski gear was piled neatly in the corner, exactly where we'd left it. But as I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. The straps on Cole's bag were undone, dangling loosely like someone had been rifling through it. Giz, I called out, my voice tight. Cole appeared in the doorway a moment later. What's up? I gestured to his bag. Did you leave it like this? He frowned, stepping inside to take a closer look. No, I'm pretty sure I fastened it. Mason and Ethan joined us, the air in the room suddenly tense. Maybe it came loose on its own, Ethan offered, though even he didn't sound convinced. Mason knelt down, inspecting the bag with his usual meticulousness. Doesn't look like it. This wasn't an accident. Should Silas have? Cole trailed off, his face pale. Why would he? Mason stood, brushing snow off his pants. He doesn't strike me as the petty thief type, but someone definitely moved it. A heavy silence settled over us, broken only by the faint creak of the cabin settling. Finally, Ethan clapped his hands together, forcing a grin. All right, let's not freak out over nothing. It's probably just one of us forgetting. No big deal. But it was a big deal. We all knew it. Dinner was a quiet affair. Mason cooked while Ethan tried to lighten the mood with jokes that fell flat. Cole barely touched his food, and I couldn't stop glancing toward the hallway, half expecting Silas to appear at any moment. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Mason spoke up. "Did anyone notice the footprints outside this morning?" "What footprints?" Ethan asked, his tone wary. Mason set his fork down, his expression serious. "When I stepped out to check the weather, I saw tracks leading away from the cabin, but they didn't come back." "Maybe it was Silas?" Cole suggested. "Maybe." Mason didn't sound convinced. "But they didn't lead toward his room. They went into the woods." No one had a response to that. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and for the first time, I felt genuinely trapped. The vast wilderness that had seemed so beautiful earlier now felt like a prison, its silence oppressive. After dinner, as we were cleaning up, Ethan tripped over something in the hallway. "Hey, what the?" We all turned to see him holding up a small, folded piece of paper. It was yellowed with age, as if it had been tucked away somewhere for a long time. He unfolded it, revealing a single line scrawled in jagged handwriting, "Leave while you can." Cole's breath hitched. Mason grabbed the note, studying it closely. "This isn't fresh. The paper's old. Could have been left here years ago. Or it could have been Silas," Ethan said, his voice tight, "trying to scare us." I glanced toward the far end of the hall, where the door to Silas's room was closed. The silence from behind it was deafening, like a void that swallowed all sound. "We should talk to him," Cole whispered. "Ask him if he knows anything." "No." Mason's tone was firm. "Not yet. Let's keep an eye on things and see if it gets worse." "Worse than this?" Ethan asked, waving the note for emphasis. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I knew was that the unease that had been gnawing at me since we arrived was no longer just a feeling. It was real, and it was getting harder to ignore. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint creaks and groans, like footsteps pacing outside my door. I told myself it was just the wind, the old wood shifting under the weight of the storm, but deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with this place, and I had a sinking feeling we'd only just scratched the surface. The next morning, I woke to a low grinding sound that seemed to echo through the cabin. For a moment, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just the wind rattling the wood. But as the sound persisted, metal against metal, deliberate and steady, I knew better. Dragging myself out of bed, I glanced at the clock, 7:02 am. Too early for the sun to provide much warmth, and judging by the frost on the windows, the temperature had dropped further overnight. I quickly pulled on a hoodie and stepped into the hallway. It was quiet now, the kind of silence that wasn't reassuring but oppressive. Mason was already in the main room, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug. He nodded toward the back of the cabin. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my throat dry. "What was it?" "Not sure," he said. Sounded like it came from Silas's room. Cole joined us a moment later, rubbing his arms for warmth. "Do you think he's working on something? I mean, he is the caretaker, right?" "Maybe," Mason said, though he didn't sound convinced. By the time Ethan finally dragged it himself out of bed, the tension in the cabin had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Mason suggested we spend the day hiking around the nearby trails, a way to keep ourselves occupied and shake off the strange energy that seemed to hang over us. The trails were beautiful, blanketed in fresh snow. The cold air was sharp but invigorating, and for a while, it felt like we'd escaped whatever was happening in the cabin. Ethan was his usual exuberant self, racing ahead and pretending to get lost, while Cole stuck, close to Mason, chatting quietly. But even out here, I couldn't relax. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A branch bending, a shadow shifting. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just endless white and the stillness of the trees. At one point, Ethan stopped abruptly, pointing at the ground. "Look." We all gathered around him, staring at the faint impression in the snow. It was a footprint, larger than any of ours and strangely elongated, as if the person, or thing, that left it had been wearing oversized boots. The tracks led deeper into the forest, toward a dense thicket of pines. Cole shivered. "Maybe it's a hunter. In the off-season." Mason replied doubtful. Ethan grinned, though there was an edge to it. "Let's follow it." "No," I said quickly, the word out of my mouth before I could stop myself. "We don't know who, or what, made that." He rolled his eyes. "Come on, Alex, what's the worst that could happen?" "I don't know," I shot back. "And I don't want to find out." Mason stepped between us, his voice calm but firm. "Alex is right. Let's stick to the main trail. We don't want to get lost out here." Ethan muttered something under his breath but didn't argue further. As we continued hiking, the footprint lingered in the back of my mind, an unanswered question that made my skin crawl. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the snow. Silas's room door was still closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching us. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, felt like a signal. Cole went straight to the kitchen to make tea, while Ethan flopped onto the couch, scrolling through his phone. Mason, ever the investigator, disappeared into the storage room. I followed him, curious. The room was exactly as we'd left it, but Mason was crouched by the far wall, examining something on the floor. "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer. He gestured to a corner where the wood was slightly discolored. "Looks like water damage, but..." He trailed off, pressing his ear to the floor. A moment later, he knocked lightly, and the sound that came back was hollow. I frowned. "There's a space under there, R." "Maybe." He straightened up, his brow furrowed. "Could be a crawl space or a storage area. But if that's the case, why wouldn't Silas mention it?" "Because he doesn't want us to know," I said, the words out before I could stop myself. Mason glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Let's not jump to conclusions, but it's worth keeping in mind." After dinner, Ethan finally had enough of the tension. He slammed his fork onto the table, startling all of us. "Okay, seriously, what's the deal with Silas? The guy barely talks, he's creeping us out, and now we're finding footprints in secret crawl spaces." I say we confront him. "No," Mason said sharply. "Not yet. We don't know enough." "Zen, what do you suggest?" Ethan snapped. "We just sit here and wait for something else weird to happen." "We stay calm," Mason replied. "We keep an eye on things, gather information. If we push him too hard, we could make things worse." "And what if he's dangerous?" Cole whispered. The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. "We'll handle it," Mason said finally, his voice steady. "Together." But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound, the wind, the creak of the cabin, the faint hum of the heater, felt like a warning. At some point, I heard movement in the hallway, soft and deliberate. I sat up, my heart pounding, and strained to listen. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I held my breath, waiting, but after a few agonizing moments, they moved on. I wanted to believe it was just Silas making his rounds, but the way the steps paused, paced at each door, made my skin crawl. Morning arrived with a pale gray sky that offered no reprieve from the cold. The cabin, though small and cluttered with evidence of its age, had never felt more imposing. Every creak of the wood, every muted whistle of wind through the windows, seemed like a message we weren't equipped to understand. By now, none of us could ignore the growing tension. The strange footprints, the odd noises at night, Silas's looming presence. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle we were too afraid to solve. But Mason was the first to act. "We need to check his room," he announced as we huddled in the kitchen. The coffee pot sputtered weakly, the smell of stale grounds doing little to calm our nerves. "What?" Cole looked up from his mug, his expression a mix of surprise and fear. "His room," Mason repeated. "Silas is hiding something. The guest logs, the way he watches us, the note. It's all too deliberate. We can't just wait for the next thing to happen." Ethan crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. "And what if he catches us? He doesn't seem like the kind of guy who'd just let that slide." Mason shrugged, his tone calm but resolute. "Zen will deal with it. I don't like sneaking around either, but I like being kept in the dark even less." I couldn't disagree. The unease I'd felt since we arrived had grown into something sharper, more urgent. Whatever Silas was up to, it was becoming clear that we weren't safe. "Fine," Ethan said finally. "But if he comes back while we're in there, I'm throwing you under the bus." Silas's room was at the far end of the hallway, the door slightly warped from years of use. For someone who supposedly lived here full time, his presence was strangely invisible. No shoes left out, no jacket hanging in the entryway, no signs that anyone but us had been using the kitchen or bathroom. Mason knelt in front of the door, a thin metal ruler in his hands. He'd found it in the maintenance closet earlier, claiming it could work as a makeshift lockpick. I stood behind him, my breath fogging in the cold air as I kept watch for any sign of Silas. Almost. "Got it," Mason muttered, his fingers deftly working the ruler. The lock clicked. My stomach dropped. Mason pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning like they were protesting our intrusion. The room was surprisingly sparse. Just a bed with an old quilt, a wooden chair, and a small dresser. There were no personal items, no photographs, no books. It was as if the space had been stripped of any identity. But then we saw the chest. It was tucked beneath the bed, its dark wood almost blending into the shadows. Mason dragged it out, and Ethan knelt beside him, running his hands over the iron latch. "Locked, of course," Ethan said. "Got any more tricks up your sleeve, Mason?" Mason didn't answer. He stood, scanning the room until his eyes landed on a rusty crowbar leaning against the wall near the dresser. "This should work. Wait," Cole said, his voice trembling. What if whatever's in there isn't meant for us to see?" Mason turned to him, his expression unreadable. "That's exactly why we need to see it." The first blow of the crowbar splintered the wood around the latch. The sound echoed in the small room, making me flinch. Mason struck again, and this time the chest popped open with a loud snap. Inside were a few faded papers, a bundle of frayed rope, and an old radio with its wires meticulously cut. But it was the papers that caught my attention. Mason pulled them out, spreading them on the bed. "What is this?" Ethan asked, leaning over to read. The papers were guest records, much older than the ones we'd found in the maintenance closet. Most of the names were crossed out, with notes scrawled in the margins, "Canceled." "No show, rebooked." But it was the last page that stopped us cold. Our names were listed, along with the date we'd arrived. Next to it, written in the same jagged handwriting as the note we'd found in the hallway, was a single word, "Stay." "What the hell does that mean?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising. Mason shook his head. "I don't know, but this isn't just a coincidence. He knew we were coming. He planned for us. Cole was pale, his hands gripping the back of the chair. Planned what? To scare us? To hurt us? Maybe both, Mason said grimly. We need to leave? Leave? Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in it. And how do you suggest we do that? We're snowed in, there's no cell service, and the shuttle isn't coming back for days. We'll figure something out, Mason said. But staying here isn't an option. Before anyone could respond, a loud crash echoed through the cabin. It came from the main room. He's back? Cole gasped, his eyes wide. We scrambled out of Silas's room, leaving the chest and its contents behind. The main room was empty, but the front door was wide open, snow blowing in and dusting the floor. Did he just leave? Ethan whispered. Maybe he heard us, I said. Maybe he knows, Mason said. He grabbed the crowbar, his knuckles white. We'll need to lock this place down. If he comes back. The lights flickered and went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. Cole fumbled with his phone, turning on the flashlight, the weak beam cutting through the gloom. Stay together, Mason ordered. We'll check the generator. The generator was in a small shed behind the cabin, accessible through a narrow path lined with trees. The snowstorm had eased, but the wind still howled, biting at my face as we trudged outside. The shed door was ajar, the padlock hanging loose. Mason pushed it open cautiously, his flashlight sweeping over the machinery inside. The generator had been deliberately tampered with, wires yanked free, parts scattered across the floor. Looks like he didn't want us to have power, Mason muttered. Why is he doing this? Cole whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. I don't know, Mason said. But whatever his reason, he's escalating. We need to be ready. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and paranoia. Every noise, every shadow felt like a threat. We took turns keeping watch, the crowbar and a kitchen knife our only weapons. But Silas didn't return. By dawn, the storm had cleared, leaving the landscape eerily quiet. Mason worked on the radio, trying to reconnect the wires. Ethan kept an eye on the windows, while Cole sat beside me, his hands trembling. I don't think I can do this, Cole admitted. I want to go home. We all do, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Suddenly, Mason cursed under his breath. Got it. The radio crackled to life, a garbled voice cutting through the static. Cabin 3 emergency. This is Cabin 3, Mason said quickly. We need help. We're snowed in, and someone's trying to. The line went dead. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Ethan said what we were all thinking. He cut the power. What if he's listening to the radio too? Before Mason could answer, a sound came from the hallway, the unmistakable creak of a door opening. Silas was still here, and he wasn't alone. The creak of the door stopped us cold. The cabin, already oppressive in its silence, felt suffocating as the sound echoed down the hallway. We froze, each of us holding our breath as we strained to hear the faintest hint of movement. Then, footsteps. Deliberate, heavy, approaching. Ethan tightened his grip on the crowbar, his knuckles white. Cole backed into the corner of the room, his phone flashlight trembling in his hand. Mason motioned for us to stay quiet, his finger to his lips, but the fear in his eyes was impossible to miss. The footsteps stopped just outside the room where we huddled. For an agonizing moment, nothing happened. No sound, no movement, just the suffocating weight of our own terror. And then the doorknob turned. Move, move. Mason hissed, shoving us toward the opposite door that led into the adjacent hallway. We stumbled through just as the main door creaked open behind us. I caught a glimpse of a shadow, a figure stepping into the room, but Mason didn't let me look back. We ran. The hallway felt endless, each step echoing like gunfire against the wood, paneled walls. The faint glow of Cole's flashlight bobbed erratically, casting distorted shadows that made the space feel alive and hostile. Behind us, the sound of footsteps resumed. Faster now, more deliberate. This way, Ethan barked, leading us into the storage room at the end of the hall. He slammed the door shut and jammed the crowbar against the handle. The footsteps stopped again, just outside. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a low, guttural voice called out, muffled through the door. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was unmistakably Silas's. But there was something different about it now. An edge of fury mixed with desperation. He didn't pound on the door or try to force his way in. He just stood there, the silence more unnerving than any threat. Cole whimpered, his back pressed against the far wall. What does he want? Why won't he just leave us alone? Mason knelt beside the door, his ear pressed against it. I don't think he's trying to scare us anymore. I think he's trying to keep us here. Ethan frowned. Why? What's he hiding? I don't know, Mason said. But we're not going to find out by sitting here. The flashlight beam caught something on the floor. A faint seam in the wood, barely noticeable. Mason knelt down, running his fingers along the edge until he found a small groove. It was the crawl space he'd suspected earlier, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Help me, he said, gesturing to Ethan. Together, they pried the board free, revealing a dark, narrow space below. The smell of damp earth wafted up, cold and unwelcoming. You've got to be kidding me, Ethan muttered. It's our only chance, Mason said. We don't know how long that door will hold, and we can't wait for him to make the next move. One by one, we lowered ourselves into the crawl space. The air was damp and suffocating, the dirt floor uneven beneath our feet. Cole's flashlight cast long, eerie shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness. Mason led the way, his movements cautious but deliberate. The space was cramped, forcing us to stoop as we moved forward. The sound of our breathing and shuffling echoed unnaturally, making it impossible to tell how far we'd gone. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the end of the crawl space, a narrow wooden panel that seemed to lead outside. Mason pressed against it, and it gave way with a low groan, revealing the snow-covered ground beyond. We scrambled out, the cold air biting at our skin. The cabin loomed behind us, its dark silhouette imposing against the gray sky. But we didn't have time to catch our breath. We had to keep moving. The snow was deep, making it difficult to run. Cole stumbled, and Ethan hauled him to his feet without a word. Mason led the way, his focus on the faint trail that led toward the main road. Where are we going? Ethan panted. Anywhere but here, Mason replied. We just need to put as much distance as we can between us and the cabin. We hadn't gone far when we heard it. The sound of a snowmobile engine roaring to life. I glanced back and saw him, Silas, perched on the snowmobile, his face a mask of fury. He didn't hesitate. The machine lurched forward, the headlights cutting through the snow as he bore down on us. Run, Mason shouted. The next moments were a blur of chaos. The snowmobile engine roared behind us, growing louder with each passing second. The cold air burned my lungs, and my legs ached with every step, but I couldn't stop. None of us could. Ethan veered off to the side, grabbing a large branch from the ground. As the snowmobile drew closer, he swung it with all his might, striking the front of the vehicle. The impact sent Silas tumbling into the snow. Go, Ethan yelled, waving us forward. I'll hold him off. No, Cole cried, but Mason grabbed his arm and pulled him along. We didn't look back. By the time we reached the main road, the snowmobile engine had gone silent. I didn't know if Ethan was okay, and we didn't have time to find out. Mason spotted a snowplow in the distance, a faint orange light cutting through the gray. He waved his arms frantically, shouting until the driver spotted us. The plow came to a halt, and an older man leaned out of the cab, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What are you kids doing out here?" he asked. "This area is supposed to be closed." "Help us," Mason said, his voice hoarse. "There's someone after us." The driver didn't need convincing. He ushered us into the cab, cranking up the heater as we tried to explain what had happened. He radioed for backup, and within minutes, a second vehicle arrived, this one carrying 2 uniformed officers. The officers listened intently as we recounted the events at the cabin. Their expressions grew darker with every detail. "You said his name was Silas," one of them asked. "Yes," Mason said. "He's the caretaker." The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "That's impossible. Silas was fired months ago. The new caretaker hasn't even started yet." We didn't return to the cabin. The officers assured us they'd investigate, but they advised us to stay in town until the shuttle service resumed. Ethan arrived at the station hours later, battered but alive. He'd managed to knock Silas unconscious long enough to escape. We never learned what happened to Silas. The officers found the cabin empty, the snowmobile abandoned near the woods. The guest logs and papers we'd found were gone, leaving no evidence of the strange, deliberate way our stay had been orchestrated. But I didn't need proof. I knew what we'd experienced was real. As we boarded the shuttle back to civilization, I couldn't help but glance at the mountains one last time. The cabin was hidden somewhere among them, a dark memory I'd never escape. We survived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Silas hadn't been acting alone, that there was something, or someone, still out there, watching and waiting.